I good to go? All right. Hello and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the fourth lecture of our 29th annual LA Days series. Thank you for those of you joining us in person for braving this windy day, and thank you for those of you joining us online. I'm Anna Rapino, and I'm one of the co-presidents of the student chapter of ASLA, pardon me, and I will be introducing our guest speaker. But before we do that today, I'd like to thank some of our sponsors for helping make this event happen. We'd like to say thank you to the Colorado State University, to CSU, the Department of Horticulture and Landscape Architecture, the Colorado chapter of ASLA, and the Colorado student chapter of ASLA. Now I'd like to go into a brief introduction of our speaker for the night, Chip Sullivan. Chip Sullivan, wonderful. FASLA is an artist and professor of landscape architecture and environmental planning at the College of Environmental Design, University of California, Berkeley. He has devoted his career to exploring and promoting landscape architecture as an intersection of art and ecology. Sullivan is the author of many popular titles in the profession, including Drawing the Landscape, Garden and Climate, and Illustrated History of Landscape Design, co-authored with Elizabeth Bultis, ASLA. His latest book, Cartooning the Landscape, concerns the metaphysics of drawing and learning how to see. The Foundation for Landscape Studies selected Cartooning the Landscape for the 2017 John Brickenorf Jackson Prize for Accomplishment in the field of garden history and landscape studies. Chip Sullivan is a former McDowell Fellow, the renowned artist community in Peterborough, New Hampshire. He is also a recipient of a Rockefeller Foundation Fellowship in the Bellagio Study Center in Lake Como, Italy, and a fellowship of the Ligurian Center of the Arts and Humanities in Bulgaisio, pardon me if I butchered that, Italy. He was a 1985 Fellow in Landscape Architecture at the American Academy in Rome. Sullivan was the subject of a documentary titled The Professor for a series of films on creativity by Emmy Award-winning director Alan Holzman. Chip received the 2016 J. D. Carpenter Teaching Medal, one of the highest awards in the American Society of Landscape Architects, presents each year in recognition of sustained excellence in landscape architecture education. He is Fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects and Fellow of the Council of Educators in Landscape Architecture. Without further ado, I'd like to pass it along to Mr. Sullivan.
Plugged in here. Is that hooked in? Does that look hooked? There. No, I think I'm hooked up. Plug this in, and you can hear me okay? Am I good? Good to go? Okay. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. You know, like I've been coming, I don't even want to think about how many years I've been coming here, and I really appreciate it. Thank you, the student organization and Anna for picking me up at the airport and showing me all these, you know, we went to the underground speakeasy bar for dinner last night. If you haven't been there, you need to go there. And thanks to Kelly for kind of like shepherd me in here, you know, like and Brad and Joe and Laura and everybody else that more than I can mention for inviting me back. It's one of my favorite places to be, and that's the truth. You know, it's the one time of the year I get to shoot pool all day long. And what's the name of the brewery? Coopersmith's. You're so lucky to have a place like Coopersmith. You know, like I travel halfway around the world just for Coopersmith's. So anyway, like let's get started. So like I'm going to talk. My lecture's broken up into three things. I'm going to start with Hideo Miyazaki's work, and then talk about some of the work I've been doing in The Wisdom of Place, and then kind of finish up with talking about like how cartooning the landscape came about. But I never really knew who Miyazaki was until I was doing a series of kind of edited films with one of my students who was really into film and went on to become a production designer in Los Angeles. And his latest film that he did was King Kong Meets Godzilla. He did all the set design for that. It was a pretty accomplishment. But one of the things we wanted to do is I wanted to put together a series of film clips on landscape in film and landscape and animation films. And he kept putting in this kind of Japanese animator in there, Miyazaki, who I had no idea who it was. And the more I saw his films, the more I got blown away by the quality of his work. But more recently, I've started to think about like his sensitivity to the environment. And I'm really stoked to be doing this because just 2 weeks ago, I went to Los Angeles at the brand new the Academy of Arts museum that had a specific show on Miyazaki, and the work blew me away. So this is right off the press, hot off the press. But one of the first things I wanted to think about is how many of you have been alone in the woods and felt a presence, right? And I kind of think about, what is that? And that's one of the things you see predominating in Miyazaki's films, is this kind of like spiritual sense of the landscape. And if you've seen any of his films operate on all these different levels, but he has a really deep sense of the environment that I think is really, really important. But you also think about this idea of world building. And one of the films that I think is really applicable to what we're doing now is Nausicaa from the Valley of the Winds. But if you're familiar with the film or not familiar with the films, one of the things that's there is humanity has destroyed the world. And centuries, like millions of years ahead of time, the forest has created this kind of poisonous gas where it's protected itself, and it's deadly to humans. But to think about that as world building, to make that convincing, he had to design the plants. I mean, think about designing a plant from scratch. And in this particular image, you can kind of see how he's taking it from the spores. He's taking the plant through its whole growth system. He's showing how it kind of intersects under the earth, and he's kind of like showing how it pollinates and everything. So he's visualizing and creating this whole forest from scratch. I mean, imagine inventing a whole world. It's pretty amazing. And then the other thing, to make films convincing, it's something that's called world building, which is what we do as landscape architects. We're trying to create convincing narratives of landscape. So he had to design a whole landscape, a whole continent, with the Sea of Corruption, the polluted forest, and the area where Nausicaa Valley of the Wind, the reason they can live is because the prevailing breezes pushes the poisonous spores from the Sea of Corruption away from that. So he had to really kind of come up with this whole kind of thing. And it's kind of interesting that he wanted to create, instead of like looking at nature as defenseless, he wanted to come up with a nature that was defensive, that was defending itself, that was poisonous to humans. And if you think about it, I remember my first trip to California, I got poison oak. And if you think about poison oak and poison ivy, it exists at the edge of the forest to keep people out. It's one of those, it's kind of almost like this. It protects you from going into the forest, which I think is an interesting analogy. Now, one of the things I've learned over teaching, years of teaching, and like having the ability to kind of look and research things, I began to realize something really interesting in film and literature and kind of historical mythology, is truth is always revealed in the forest. And if you've seen the film North by Northwest and other Hitchcock's films like Vertigo, truth is always revealed in the forest. And one of the things I'm looking at here is our vocabulary in landscape architecture is not only based on these sort of ecological principles, but these sacred elements, like that we have this possibility. Now imagine we plant forest, and historically truth has been revealed in a forest which we plant, which I think is really, really interesting. And if you look at this idea of the Sea of Corruption, for Nausicaa, she learns the truth in the forest. She discovers what is happening, why it is the Sea of Corruption, why this forest has built this kind of polluted atmosphere to protect itself from humans. And also the other interesting thing that Miyazaki did is not only he invented this forest, but he invented the insects and animals that live in this forest. So if you think about it as a designer, imagine creating an ecosystem, designing the plants to survive and the life cycles of those plants, and then designing the insects and wildlife that survive on these plants. I think that's pretty impressive. But the other thing I like about this film is Nausicaa is not only is she a warrior princess, and a protector of her people, but she's also kind of a natural scientist. I mean, she's collecting specimens from the Sea of Corruption to kind of unlock the keys of that. And if you look at Nausicaa from Valley of the Wind, and you can see the parallel through what we've been through for the last 3 years. We've been living in polluted air. We're all wearing masks. We wore masks for 2 years. It's a shame we didn't design masks like Nausicaa. But if you think about it, like, what does this mean? The 2012 was supposed to be the year of destruction, and the Earth is slowly, I thought it was going to be a big giant, meteor smashing into the Earth. But it's been, since 2012, a whole series of ecological disasters. But if you think about that, that's a pretty powerful parallel, that our air is polluted in such effect that we can't live in it. But the other thing I like about Nausicaa is that she was studying the forest. And one of the things that she found out, and I like this element of optimism, is that she found out that the forest, which was protecting itself from humanity because of humanity destroyed it, is that it was actually cleansing itself. And she found this when she was in the forest and fell through a series of layers and was down at the bottom and found all of a sudden she could breathe without her mask, and the air was pure and the water was pure. And in her laboratory, which I think is really neat, she's been collecting these specimens and studying them, how they work. And you look at it as a kind of a landscape. I think that's really, really neat. In a thing. And then the other thing, I talked about what are those spirits of the forest. And the other thing in Princess Mononoke, one of my other favorite films is the Kodakami, which are these kind of like forest spirits that come alive. They're kind of humorous characters, and if you've been in the forest, the other weird thing about being in the woods, you're not alone, right? There's 1,000 eyes looking at you. From insects, the bugs, everything. The mosquitoes know you're there. The owls, the birds know you're there. Everybody, there's thousands and thousands of living forms in that earth that know that you're there. And also, like the other thing interesting about woods, or how many of you think you know where you're going in the forest and gotten lost? Raise your hand if you've gotten lost in the woods. So nature's kind of playing this trick on you that I think is kind of interesting. The other thing, like this other thing, and I'm going to be talking about it Saturday on our field trip, which I think is interesting, the genus loci, the spirit of the place, which is what that strange thing that you feel when you're alone in the woods. I think they're these kind of like sacred creatures. They're these, one of the neat things I like about Greek and Roman mythology is through their mythology, they personalize the landscape with a personality. And if you personalize the landscape, maybe we would be less likely to destroy it. But one of the more interesting divinities, forest divinities he created was the deer god, who at nighttime goes up into the sky, but the daytime turns themselves into this sort of deer-like character with a human face. But he also has, or the spirit also has the power to kill, but at the same time to create life. So it can kill life with its mouth, but at the same time, as his foot hit the ground plane, flowers sprout up, which I think is really interesting, which also brings in that whole idea of nature is not so perfect, right? It can kill us just as easy as we can survive in it. But looking at this character, I think in teaching sacred landscapes for the last 3 years, I've kind of come up with this idea that there's a global mythology, landscape mythology, that I think can really unify us as a world. Like almost all our mythological beliefs about the landscape are similar. Almost every culture has a sacred tree. But you look at this, when I was in Rome at St. Estacios, I realized, you look at it, this deer in Celtic mythology and European mythology, the deer god is a famous protector of the forest. And then if you look at the overlay of Christianity, basically Christianity had to take all of the pagan beliefs, the pantheonic beliefs that people were believing, and kind of overlay them and make saints. So the forest god with the antlers became Saint Estacio. And that happened because Saint Estacio was in the forest and saw a deer, and between the deer antlers was a cross. So you can't get much more obvious to that transformation of the deer spirit into kind of like the Christian belief. And this is St. Estacios in Rome, which is one of my favorite places in Rome. But even more importantly, St. Estacios is the best coffee in Rome. And it's right across the street from St. Estacios. And it's kind of interesting, they claim it's the best coffee in Rome because there are 2 aqueducts bringing water into Rome. And this water is supposed to be better than the other coffee on the other side of the Pantheon. And they're warring, people won't go to one or the other. You either go to St. Estacios or like Cafe di Ora is the other one. There are these 2, warring things. And it's both from the water of the aqueduct, which I think is kind of interesting. And then this is the night walker. Which turns, like at night and daytime, it turns into the forest goddess, and then at nighttime it turns into this other creature. And you can also look at Miyazaki, if you have a chance to study his drawings, he does these are called image boards. So he creates the image of the film with these image boards, and then the production designer and animators kind of take that and turn it in, so you can kind of see the transformation, the early on design where the night walker still had antlers. And then there's something else that I think is interesting. One of the oldest forms of divining from oracles was the sacred spring. And I'm Irish. Next to almost every Catholic church in Ireland is a sacred spring. And they kind of acknowledge it, that they pass it off. I said, oh, what is that? Oh, that's just, don't pay any attention to that. That's the sacred spring. So, but there's this belief that, you know, the springs were one of the first forms of the oracle, you know. So there's this idea in the Miyazaki, and that's the other thing we design, is we design water features. You know, and I particularly like this scene because it's a sacred lake, and then there's the sacred island. You know, there's this idea of, in landscape, with the island, that's a place we want to go to. And in this island is also the sacred tree. And if you think about it, one of the things we do as landscape architects is we have the ability to plant sacred trees, which I think is really interesting. And I saw this still when I was at the exhibition in Los Angeles. It just showed for a second, and I was lucky to find it on the internet. But this is the drive when the family is leaving the city and driving out to their country house where they're going to live. That's the landscape where Totoro's tree is. And I think this is also interesting, you know, that Miyazaki talks about the Shinto shrines in Japan. They're always in an evergreen forest, and they're also close to where people live. They're kind of like this kind of like interesting kind of juxtaposition. You know, like, I'm not even going to try to say that word, but it's kind of a semi-natural area close to where people live. And this is where the kind of, again, the sacred tree. And if you think about the sacred tree, one of the things that I've learned that's really cool is we know about the tree of knowledge, the biblical tree of knowledge, which was, you know, there are no apples in them, you know, like out, you know, like, and we look at all the, you know, where did Buddha gain enlightenment? Under a tree. And you start to see like almost every culture has, in Africa, the baobab tree. You know, like, and then there's this bar I go to in Haight-Ashbury that has the best martinis have you been to this Abzam room, or the Zamzam room? And the best martinis that I've ever had in my life. But it's a Persian setup. It's set up like a Persian carpet, and there's this painting behind the bar that had like all these vegetation and stuff. I took a picture of it, and I showed it to one of my Persian friends, because I said, have you been to this bar? And she looked at the painting, she says, oh my God. She says, you know, like in Iran, where I'm from, there is this mythical thing about the sacred tree, where this giant eagle comes down and sprouts this giant sacred tree. So like, you know, like once you start to dig in it, you'll find this commonality in mythology that we have about the landscape. And if you think about one of the things we do, we plant trees. One of my first experiences at Sasaki is I was planting a grove of oak trees in this development. And I went back to kind of make sure they were all growing and they were in good shape. And I looked at it. And one of the cool things that I saw was there was a bird's nest in the tree. You know, so you really can't go wrong by planting a tree. I think that's one of the things that's really cool. And there's also, I always thought this was really weird, these kind of soot sprites, right? You know, like what are they? You know, and they keep reappearing in all of Miyazaki's films. And when I went to the exhibit, you know, like I realized that these are, in Japan, these are spirits. These are little soot sprites that actually exhibit. And you found out, like, where do they come from? Like when I swift the house, right? Where do those dust bunnies come from? You know, like, how many of you are missing a sock? Raise your hand. Where does it go? Where is it? You know, like, where does that sock go? I don't know. You know, so when I got to thank God for the Swifter. Where do all those where do they come from? Where is that? So, like, it's really interesting that these like little spirits inhabiting our domains. And the other thing too that I think's really poignant about Miyazaki's films is there's always this element of the portal. If you look at any sort of like fantastic literature or whatever, there's this element of transition that you have to make this first step to go through the doors of knowledge, you know, the doors of perception. And May, the little young girl, she's not, as you know, as an adult, we kind of lose the ability to see things as a child. So it's obviously she's the one that can kind of see the sacred way. And she goes down this, you know, again, this portal, and then there's this element of transition and this metamorphosis that takes place as she follows the little woodland spirits into the center where she discovers Totoro, which I think is really, this is a wonderful scene when she comes in there. There are butterflies and insects and birds, and, you know, like Miyazaki, people always want to know Totoro is obviously a keeper of the forest, but Miyazaki finally said, he's just, you know, when he gets questions, he's just Totoro. You know, I mean, it's so zen, isn't it, right? He's just Totoro. But he represents this really powerful thing, you know, that he's the forest keeper, you know, and he doesn't have a name. It's the little girl gives him his name because from his yawns, she's the one that names him Totoro. I mean, so, you know, like the woodland spirits, do they have names? Do they wander around talking to one another? You know, like, hey, Totoro, what's up? You know, like, So this is not only is, I think Miyazaki is a really contemporary Leonardo da Vinci. If you're looking at someone that has mastered so many things, and I'm just talking about one aspect of his film, the eco-magic, this is one of the things that he wrote about the forest deer. Like he's kind of like really kind of tapping in to kind of this universal mythology that's global that I think is really important. And these goddesses, I mean, we know about Moro writing the wolf goddess, but there's also the sacred boar, which is kind of interesting. Like in Islam and the Jewish religions, you can't eat pork, which I always thought was interesting because it wasn't so much about trichinosis. Like they thought maybe the pigs, competed with the other animals. But I think, and one of the things I learned in studying mythology, that the pig, was once a forest god. And that, by eating, you couldn't eat a divinity. So that's why I think there's this kind of like thing why you can't eat pork because you can't eat a divinity. So if you think about it, this is a pig, right? That's what we turned into a pig. So it's kind of like, like eating, like you can't eat divinity. The other thing when I saw Spirited Away that I thought, what is going on in this film? And what I realized is in a bathhouse. And what I slowly realized that this bathhouse is where the river spirits and water spirits come to get bathed because the water's so polluted. Miyazaki actually like once a month goes out and cleans streams in his region where he lives. And that's kind of where he got the idea to create a bathhouse for the river and water spirits that are dirty to happen. And there's even a festival in certain regions of Japan where they actually call out the spirits and they do a ritual bathing of the water spirits, which I think is also kind of cool. And you look at like throughout all of his films, there's always kind of like the sacred tree in all of his films. Even in Castle in the Air is actually centered around this kind of like tree of knowledge that I think is really neat. And the very last scene, everything gets peeled away and the tree of knowledge, like is floating in the air, which I think is kind of cool. And also, like, if you look at this kind of sacred forest, which is another thing, like if we look at this kind of landscape vocabulary, our landscape vocabulary, one of the things I learned, like in doing garden and climate was our vocabulary form is agricultural based. Everything, pergolas, arbors, like rivulets, it all comes from agriculture, which I think is kind of cool. But it also, there's this overlay of sacredness, that every element that we do, the sacred tree, the sacred pond, the tree of knowledge, the enchanted forest, I can go on, I think I have come up with like 300 landscape design elements in our vocabulary that have some type of sacred origin, which I think is cool. If you begin to think about that, we can actually kind of create these sacred mythologies in our landscape. And Ponyo is also an interesting film. The color palette of Ponyo is kind of interesting, but he's kind of looking at water as a purifying spirit, but also he's looking at water, again, as the water nymphs. In Italy, it's kind of interesting that the kind of Catholic priest would build Nymphaeums in their gardens. What is a Nymphaeum? What does that mean? It's a theater of the water nymphs. And water nymphs are oracles. So it's kind of interesting as sort of like an anti-pagan kind of, like religion, that you would actually build something in your garden that would call forth these kind of like spirits that kind of like, that give oracles that I think is kind of interesting, the water oracle. They also felt too that in the Renaissance gardens, if you could plant, you put a water feature, a fountain in the middle of your garden, Diana would come. And Diana is a goddess of the forest, and she's also a guardian of the sacred spring. And they felt once Diana would come, Pan and all the other gods and forest divinities would also come. Just think that's a cool idea, the optimism of that. And also, you can't discount this idea of the wizards, sorcerers and magicians that are in his films. And it's all about these characters are all about metamorphosis. This whole idea of kind of coming to school is this idea of changing. Like you're going through this metamorphosis of coming to college and transforming yourself and like getting these visions. So I think this other layover of this idea of this transformation of your vision of the landscape becomes really important. No Face, There's theories that this is really Miyazaki in his film. When I saw No Face and Spirited Away, I mean, in all of Miyazaki's films, there's always some sort of character that's watching, and some people theorize that this is Miyazaki putting himself in the film, because No Face kind of appeared on the bridge when the young protagonist is looking at the bridge. No Face shows up, and that's when he decided, I'm going to use No Face throughout the film. And if you notice, it's and Howl's Moving Castle is that weird thing hopping along. You know, that's also supposed to be Miyazaki kind of making sure the animators are doing a good job. And Spirited Away, I think, really symbolizes some really important things. If you look at the image on the right, what is that telling you? What do you see when you look at that particular image? They're going off-road. Yeah, this is a good thing. Before GPS, if you wanted to see if a couple were going to make it, you put them in a car, give them a destination, and give them a map. And if they're still talking to one another when they get there, then you know the relationship will hold up for a while. But the male ego doesn't ever stop and ask for questions. And he's really emphasizing this because the wife is going, honey, I think you're lost. And he said, no, I'm on this road, I'm going, you know, like we're not turning back, you know, which is ironic because if he had listened to her, the film wouldn't happen. So in some ways, it's kind of another sort of interesting allegory of kind of like, you know, like butt-headedness. But look, what else do you see when you look at this? What about the tree? It's prominent, but look closer at the tree. That's a Tory, what? More, yeah, that's a good point. I never thought of that. But what else? The tree's dying. So I mean, he's making a statement. This tree is in all. This is Totoro's tree. This tree's in all his films. You know, and here he might be making a statement. I like the idea that maybe it's growing back, but he's kind of showing the death of the old religion. And the Torii gate is just been pulled up and propped up against the tree trunk, you know, which I think is kind of prominent. And I like that idea, that optimism that is kind of like growing back. And if you look at this image at the top, he's really telling an important story there. What do you see when you look at the top image? Huh? Houses. And what are they doing? Exactly. And there's this other very important thing. There's this line between the sacred forest and reality. It's the idea of making that jump into the woodland, crossing that land from the known to the unknown. You know, like the forest represents the subconscious, you know, that kind of mystical qualities of the landscape. And what's even sadder, or I don't know what is, as they're driving through, they're seeing all these abandoned Shinto shrines, these small little shrines that are little god houses. You know, they're all stacked up and they're abandoned, which I think maybe he's making another important statement. But I really like this thing, the idea of the magic portal, this idea of transformation. And you have to realize that she's really hesitant to make that she has to make a decision. But also it's interesting too that this also, like if you see the film, also out of nowhere this little sculpture appears. You know, all of a sudden it's next to her and it scares her. But it's also two-faced. What's interesting about this is on the Janiculum Hill in Rome, it's named after the god Janus, which what was the month January named after? Janus. Janus is a two-headed god that looks forwards and backwards. So Janus in January is looking at the head to the new year, but also reflecting on the past. So you see the two-headed god here, you know, doing the same sort of thing, looking ahead to her future and also the back as she enters into the sacred forest. The other thing I wanted to mention, this is not one of Miyazaki's films, but I really like this idea of flower magic. If you look at the hedge witch, you know, the hedge witches really understand flowers and herbs. And you use these as creative, powerful tools. That this idea of using the landscape as a healing quality, I think, is really, really important. And one of the things I really like about this film is here's kind of the old wizard is kind of the gardener that talks to her in the garden. But then there's this sort of magic cat that appears and she wanders, she follows the cat, you know, from again, the known world to the unknown world. And again, there's that bridge. You know, that's where do trolls hang out? And what do you have to do to cross the bridge? You have to pay the toll. You know, and if you don't pay the toll, you don't get across the bridge. But the bridge is a really important metaphor, like the bridge to Tabatha, you know, like it's a portal. Like it's kind of, the bridge connects two worlds, and it takes a leap of faith to go from one world to the other, which is why you have to pay the toll. And I think this is interesting that you can even see the light, going into the dark forest where she discovers this magic plant, which then opens up all the rest of the film that she moves through it. You can also look at Miyazaki, he's very concerned about, energy conservation and alternative forms of power. And one of the things I like about Nausicaa Valley of the Wind is it's all wind powered. And Nausicaa is also a keeper of the windmills. If you've seen the film, she's climbing around the wind towers and adjusting them and making sure they're working and all the things are operating. And he went through hundreds of iterations, that look like the Dutch windmills to kind of create these. Like in California, we have the windmills over here and we have the housing here. What I like is the housing, the wind is powering the power of the individual structures, which I think, again, is a good metaphor for design that I really like. And the green architecture of Castle in the Air, you can kind of see this kind of merging of the two together that I think is really, really cool. You can see the gardens, on the terraces, and you can kind of see the architecture. And I like this, his image board at the top. I like how he's showing kind of like how the vegetation is kind of growing out of the structures at the top. Now, one of the things that Miyazaki does is he does all the image boards for all of the scenes, and he draws all the storyboards for the film. Like, if you can buy these books, he draws like almost 3,000 storyboards for each film. And what's amazing about that is, and he, this drives the producers crazy because he'll get halfway through a film and change the direction. The other thing he talks about in doing his storyboards is sometimes he feels like he's so far into the storyboards that that's the reality, and that when he stops, the world is an entirely different place. How many of you have started working on a project in studio in the afternoon, and then all of a sudden it's 4 in the morning? Raise your hand if that's happened. Where did that time go? You were in that magic space. That's where Miyazaki is when every film that he does. He's in that magical space where time kind of disappears. So he has that ability. The other thing I think is really important about this is Miyazaki, if you have a chance to watch, there are 2 documentaries on him. The earlier one on Netflix is much better. But he's right there with all his other animators. So you can see it. You'll work for nothing. If don't get a job if you can't see the boss. Because you'll work for less money if you can be the mentors there giving you ideas. If you can get feedback from the head wizard, you'll work longer. This is what happened to Disney. Disney, when he made all his money from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, he had all the money in the world to build his perfect animation studio. And unfortunately, what he did is he separated in 2 divisions. He had the in-betweeners and kind of the people just doing the drafting work, and then the designers and the specialists upstairs, and they both had separate dining rooms. And it used to be when you worked for Walt, he'd be walking through the studios and you could talk to him. When he isolated himself, this is when the animation really began to decline, I think. And most of the Pixar animators got fired at Disney. Because they were then the lower echelon, and they had ideas, but they weren't allowed, you couldn't move the ideas forward. At Pixar now, everybody can submit their ideas. So Pixar took all of and Pixar's films really do poorly, right? So you should read there's a book on the creativity of Pixar that's really interesting to talk about how they kind of created an environment where everybody can feel like they can contribute, and I think it's really important. And I think, Miyazaki is right there in the ranks. This is a sign of a good leader, right in the ranks. Like if you're a general and you're fighting and you're right there on the front line, you're not back, like in the ivory tower, sending messages. So these are some of his storyboards. If you have a chance to look at, I had to order these books from Japan, but their storyboards are like this thick. So not only doing the image boards, the first thing he does, the image boards, storyboards, and then the storyboards go to the animators. But this is a particularly good scene from Princess Mononoke with the sacred island, the sacred lake, with the view looking out beyond to the connection of the world beyond. And then I really like how he's used a watercolor in this particular drawing to for Ponyo to kind of show that kind of sacred landscape from underneath. Now, one of the things, before the pandemic started, I was supposed to go to Japan, and I was going to Studio Ghibli. This is his museum that he designed. And it's kind of interesting that animators and cartoonists can do better architecture than architecture, and animators can design better buildings than architects. It's a peculiar thing that maybe we could think about. But he wanted to design this. He had two rules for this thing. He wanted to design a passive form of architecture, and he also wanted to design a place for kids. So adults can go there, but all the doors are small, and the steps are so tiny, that, it's really, you're uncomfortable as an adult, but it's designed perfectly for kids. But he also wanted to create this form of green architecture. So it's all living, green walls, green roofs, living architecture, which is really cool. And I don't know what I think about this, but they've actually started, he has now a Studio Ghibli Disneyland where you can actually go, and that should be opening, I think, this year, which I'm kind of excited about. And this is also inside, this is one of my favorite places. This is kind of his perfect studio. And I think it's important to look at, I like looking at creative spaces, because if you go to somebody's creative space and it makes you want to sit down and start to draw there, or if you go to a writer's studio, like Hemingway's studio in Key West, I get there, I want to sit down and start typing on his typewriter. There's something about the creative space that I think is really important, which is what he created here. He has all his drawings all around. So I want to think about it in looking at this. What if Harry Potter was a landscape architect? What would the world look like? What would the world look like? It's interesting that Miyazaki's oldest son is studying landscape architecture. So what would the world look like, if Harry Potter designed the landscape? And what would the architecture school look like if it was like Hogwarts? How would the work look? It makes me think, what if we started to look at ourselves as magicians, and sorceresses? Because you're creating something out of nothing when you make a landscape. You're transforming it magically into something that wasn't there. That's a pretty cool thing to think about. So in thinking about that, this is one of my studios. Like in Richmond, Richmond is totally polluted, and there was a site there that they had to dig up all the earth. So I thought of doing a final project in my capstone studio where we look at this idea of the sea of corruption. And what would happen if this is where Nausicaa had her tower? So the idea was, since I couldn't get to Japan to see Studio Ghibli, what if this could be a West Coast version of Studio Ghibli with his exhibition space, his animation studio, a research place, and also a place for Nausicaa's wind-powered architecture, because the Bay Area is really windy. I don't know why all the houses don't have windmills. So what would that look like? And that was kind of the idea. And the other thing was that they would have to create a landscape of amelioration to kind of that's the other thing we do as designers that I think is really metaphorical and metaphysical, is that we're transforming polluted landscapes into green landscapes. So what would this landscape of amelioration be? So these are some of the projects my students did where the sea of corruption gets replaced with the real sea. And then this was really neat. What she did is, you can't really see this, but it's a disc under there where you can turn the disc and you can actually watch the landscape changing. So it's kind of like a pop-up book where you turn this wheel that's under these openings and you can actually see the landscape begin to change and metamorphosize with the kind of amelioration, which I think is really cool. So I've been lucky enough to, every except for when the pandemonium hit, I was invited to be in a show inspired by Miyazaki. So all the artists put up work that's inspired by Miyazaki. This is the first year I did Totoro's tree in a vitrine. So I showed Totoro's tree from the front, but I also showed what it looked like from the back. So you could actually walk around and see this metaphorical change. And this was a pop-up book of Nausicaa, collecting specimens for her laboratory. And this was good. The last year I did that, I was able to invite 3 of my students in the show. So it's really, it's a poor professor that students don't do better than them. So it's really great to be in a show where your students are actually doing better work than you are. So the last thing I want to talk about is this idea of divining design. About 5 years ago, my chair said, Chip, I want you to teach more graduate students. And she said, why don't you take Randy Hester's Sacred Landscapes class and teach it? And that's where all of this started. So I started teaching sacred landscapes and made me begin to think about different ways of placemaking. But the story really started in thinking about the genus loci. Liz and I decided to go to Umbria, and we stayed outside in this villa at Gubbio. And what's interesting about this, Liz is very superstitious. Every night when we were in our room, I'd wake up seeing these flashing lights, almost every night. And, I didn't tell Liz about it because, I was afraid it would freak her out. So we're leaving, and we both, tell this story, I'm telling her, I thought it was okay because it's the last day. We're leaving. And she goes, oh my God, I was seeing the same thing. So like, where did that come from? So what we found out is this abbey was on the site of a temple to the genus loci, the genus of the place, which is one of the things I think is really neat about Greek and Romans, is they created temples to the genius of the place, the spirits that were there. So perhaps what we were seeing was like the spirits of the place were actually talking to us. And on the way out, we found this shrine that had been driven by maybe 25 times, this shrine to the visions of Saint Ubaldo, who was there, that in the 60s also had similar visions of this space and created the shrine. So we leave, and we're going around the corner. We're driving down this mountain road, and we turn a corner, and let's go next one. There's a monk, a Franciscan monk hitchhiking. And when was the last time you picked up a hitchhiker? So we're looking at each other going, how can we not pick up a hitchhiking Franciscan monk? We were just there with St. Francis, right, giving us this vision. So we picked him up. Liz is driving. I don't speak any Italian, so they're talking back and forth, like carrying on a conversation in Italian. So we get down to the bottom of the hill, and he says, you can let me off at the gas station here. And then he said, like before he left, he said, can I give you my blessing? So, I'm not religious, but, what the hell? I'm not going to say no, right? Yeah, sure, I'll take your blessing. So he gets out of the car. He gives us his blessing, gets out of the car. And then Liz and I look at each other and say, well, maybe we should give him some money. So we turn over to look at, he's disappeared. He wasn't there. And you've all heard those stories, like once a year, someone's driving down a lonely road. They pick up somebody hitchhiking. They take them to the diner. They drop them off. They go into the diner, and they tell this story to everybody in the diner, and everybody freaks out, because that person died there on the anniversary of the death, that person died on that spot. And this is also an interesting story that it kind of goes through history. What is that about? When you pick up somebody, what is that passageway? So anyway, I don't know what to think about that. So these kind of things all started to add up when we went we were staying in Rome, and we went to, typically this is called, the Temple of Hercules. And we got to go inside. We got a special tour to go inside. Then we're climbing up the ladder. And just as the guide is saying, watch your head, Liz hits her head really hard, almost knocks herself out. Senza la testa. So she's so dizzy. She sits down, and she's trying to get, come out of it, get her. And when she slowly comes out, she looks down to her right, and there's a deck of Italian tarot cards. And what we found out is the guide said, well, this really isn't the temple to Hercules. This is the temple to the goddess Fortuna. This is the temple of fortune. So think about it. Like she gets hit on the head, almost blacks out, and gets a deck of tarot cards in the temple of Fortuna, and that was years ago before we started to put this together. So teaching this class, I began to think about where do tarot cards come from? Where did the gypsies come from? Gypsies are short for Egyptians. Supposedly they all come from India, but they migrated to Egypt, and supposedly they garnered these secrets from Egypt, and they're known for their divination as they travel through the world. But what I did, one of the things I was trying to do in my sacred landscapes, just like I'm talking about now, each one of my lectures, I wanted my students to come up with 4 kind of design guidelines that they could use. They could take these sacred design concepts from my lecture and turn it into a vocabulary that they could use. So after the second or third kind of review, I'm looking at these things, the format I gave them, and I'm saying, these look like tarot cards. What do you think? Would you like to do a deck of tarot cards? And they unanimously said yes. And so it turned out to be one of the best classes I've taught, because students generated the idea, so they were way into it. So for 2 years in a row, we did tarot cards, and I had them printed in China. And they were really interesting. But then what do you do with the tarot cards? So like the design, can anybody define love? Can you define the creative process? Can you define inspiration? So like how do you define divination? So I tried to come up with this way of using this deck of sacred landscape designs. How could you come up with a design program? I mean, design programs are ambiguous. Somebody just sits down and make it up. But what if you created a design program based on sacred principles? So I came up with this idea of the medicine wheel spread, where the first card that you draw is the genus loci of the space. So basically what you're using is the cards to create your design program. And then using the journey of the heroine, the second card you pull is the card to adventure, which kind of sets you on the journey through that landscape. And the third car is crossing the threshold into the unknown, which we talked about in Miyazaki's films. There's also this idea of going through the portal and going into the other world. So you make that decision to go in the portal, but like the journey of the heroine, you always have these trials, like the eight trials of Hercules. You know, you always have these trials. So you have to learn this and overcome this knowledge to kind of move on. And then the resolution and the enlightenment, if you do a design that doesn't have some sort of form of narrative or enlightenment, you might as well give it up. I mean, almost think about the landscapes you've been in that really give you a message. You know, that it's kind of going to a movie, and if you don't talk about anything on the way home, the movie sucks. But if you're talking about the movie in the car on the way home, and you're talking about it a week later, and you're still thinking about it a month later, that's what a landscape should be. That's what the landscape should give you. So that's kind of the idea. So I would do the medicine wheel spread. Each student kind of came up with their own design vocabulary, and then then from that they designed a garden. I gave them a design space, and some of the most amazing inventive work I've ever seen. They really liked it because it felt, they're in their second year of design school. You know, it felt like that it really unconstricted them from these kind of constricted programs and really allowed their minds to free up and do some really, really inventive. This is our final review where I did readings from the cards. So this was kind of the final position. And it really came up with some really interesting design. So I had them also do the medicine wheel spread and also kind of put the cards that they used to create these landscapes. And these landscapes were really, really interesting. So one of the interesting things about this, you know, like that made me think about it, I was at a CMG big party, a Christmas party. And I was talking to one of Liz's former students, and I said, you know, what's going on? And he says, oh, I've started my own firm. And he says, what are you working on? I told him about these tarot cards. And he said, Chip, come over here. He says, don't tell anybody this. But when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my career, I had my cards read. And it told me I should go out and start my own office. But he said, but don't tell anybody. So what I found out, you know, since I've done, there's a whole underground move. People actually believe in tarot cards, but they won't admit it. You know, it's a really phenomenal. He said, you know, I thought it was interesting. I couldn't tell, but I've told this story a million times now because it's such a good story. So no matter what. But so, Liz and I, we have a friend who works for the ASLA in Washington, D.C., and we were there visiting, and like we went out for beers afterwards. And she's the director of kind of the workshops. And she asked us what we were doing. You know, and I told her, Liz and I have been working on these tarot cards, you know, like, and she said, oh yeah, my roommate in college was, you know, really into, she would stay up all night dealing the cards. So we have another beer, and she says, like, you know, like, why don't you do a tarot card workshop at the ASLA convention in San Diego? And, you know, like, I mean, this is the ASLA, you know, which I'm going, holy shit, you know, like, well, okay, we'll think about it. So, like, when it came time to make the submissions, you know, I wrote her and I said, now, are you sure? Nothing's worse than being rejected, right? You'd almost not want to send in an entry, you know, just to avoid being dejected and rejected. So she said, no, I want you to do it. So we actually got this thing accepted. So when Liz and I are putting together our workshop, we were expecting 20 to 25 people. The idea was everybody would make a card, and we'd have these cards, and we'd deal them, and then we could kind of come up with a design. So we come in there, and they put us in this giant room. And nothing's worse than giving a lecture with 10 people in a giant room. So we're thinking, what the hell are we going to do? You know, so like right before we were supposed to go on stage, the room filled up. It's like over 220 people in this room. They had to turn away like 50 people. You know, so like we're thinking, well, like the ASLA has finally entered the age of Aquarius. You know, they think they finally, this new generation, there's hope, right? There's hope for everybody. So, you know, like we were totally unprepared for the last half hour of the last hour of the thing. So what happened is, like, Liz and I, it's a half an hour to go, and we're thinking, like, what are we going to do? You know, because everybody made their own tarot cards, which is what we're going to do on Saturday. We're going to make a Genus Loci card before we go out and do the spirit walk. So before we could say anything, somebody raised their hand and said, can I, you know, there was a mic and an overhead projector, can I show my card? So she runs up and puts her card, and before I knew it, there was a line of like 20 people, couldn't wait to talk about their cards. It's almost like AA, you know, it's kind of the confessional, right? Everybody wanted to tell their story about their cards. It's the most amazing experience I think I've had, going from the terror, you know, the dejection of, oh my God, what are we going to do, to kind of like further reinforcing this idea of maybe we're ready for the age of Aquarius in design. Maybe we're ready to make that transition to the next space. So during the pandemonium, like in studying sacred landscapes, I got this book called kind of like the calendar of pagan days. So almost every day of the year, it has a pagan, some sort of pagan holiday, which, as we know, paganism is based on nature, some nature-based belief. So what we decided to do for the month of May, you've heard the merry month of May. One of the things in Ireland they do on May 1st is they go out and they collect the dew from the May dew, and this is supposed to be a healing quality. They also roll around in the dew during May. So like we found, like almost every day was this interesting kind of nature-based ritual. So I would do a card based on a natural ritual, and then Liz would do the next card. So we altered back and forth to create like the 31 days. I wanted to do the whole year, but it'd be too hard. We actually won an international competition. Well, we finished second in the international competition in England, which was kind of cool. And then the other thing, I mentioned, if you think about this too, I mean, one of the things as landscape architects we do is we put fountains in the landscape, right? So when you go to the worst looking shopping mall that you've ever been to and you go to the water feature, what is in the water? Why? It's a crappy place. Why? Wishes. Why do you wish in a well, and why do you put money in the water? Where does that come from? How did you know that? Where does it come from? Do you? My theory is the sacred spring was one of the first forms of the oracle, along with the tree. So what you're doing, somehow deep in our DNA, when you're throwing money in a water feature, you're making kind of like a gift to some unknown goddess of prophecy, though some unknown water nymph that we still think dwell in the water, which I think is really kind of interesting. And water is different from a wishing well, because a wishing well is hollow. Wishing well, I think, is you're connected to the earth spirit. It goes into the earth. This is a channel to the earth, where the water feature is more connected to the water nymph. Oh, what happened? What's happened? Yeah, concentrate. Imagine yourself like in a desert. Oh, okay, good. All right, okay. So we had this was another weird experience there at the this New England Museum was having a show on the spirits of place or something, and people kept sending us the applications. Said, Chip and Liz, you need to apply for this. So one of the things we thought about, because we're writing a book on the tarot cards, so using this metaphorical thing, and we've done the 22 major arcana cards and written them up. So we thought about, like, how could we make, one of the first forms of prophecy was also listening to the wind blow through the trees, and that was a prophetic form. So we thought about, like, what if we take our tarot cards and hang them in the tree as part of this exhibit, and we would do it. And this was like at the title of the exhibit was perfect, The Land of Enchantment, and this was at the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge, Maine, Massachusetts. So the idea was that we would hang these cards. We mounted them on aluminum, so that they were permanent, put them on swizzles, so when you would approach the tree, they would be turning. And the reflection of the card, that was what you would read. So the cards that when you walk into the tree, they're all turning. And the first three that you notice would be your prophecy. And so these were some of the images, and then there was a guide where you could pick up the guide, and once you selected the trees, you could read your prophecy from the oracle tree. So this is a way of connecting us back to one of the original forms of divination. And this was the tree, which we're really lucky, and it was really, again, it was really interesting to see how the kids reacted to it. And it wasn't easy to do. The day we put it up was one of the worst thunderstorms. So we survived like 3 or 4 really bad thunderstorms. We went back, oh my, but everything existed, so it survived the thunderstorms. So thinking about the creative process, which I was talking about today, I was asked to do the cover for Randy Hester's new book on Design as Democracy. And of course I said, yeah. He said, what do you want? I mean, I owe my whole career to Randy Hester because he was the chair when I started. He really didn't have to like my work, but he did. He says, what will you charge? I mean, how could I charge him anything? I said, like, I'll do it for a bottle of Irish whiskey and 3 cigars. And he says, got it. And he actually got me the bottle of Irish whiskey and the 3 cigars. But I had to read the whole goddamn, like, manuscript. And near Berkeley, I said, like, how am I going to make anything out of this? And I was batting around ideas, and right near the campus is a place called Top Dog, where you can actually get meat in Berkeley. Probably the only place you can get real meat, And I always go there, and for years I go there and I always sit at the stool on the left. And next to the stool on the left is this drawing that I'd been looking at for years and years and years. And finally I looked at that and I said, this is how I can assemble all of these diverse chapters into kind of one unified form. So from that, the first thing they said, so like this is the map. So it's kind of like this idea of reading the chapters and kind of getting up to the reform. But also it shows all of these side things that you can be led off the path to knowledge. It's kind of, because my mother was Irish, I always grew up with this saying. I said, I'm going to do that, I'm going to do that. And she said, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And that's like, right? So this is kind of like finally getting back at my mom and doing it. So I finished that and they go, Chip, that looks great. That looks great. But like when you get to the end of the book, can you do something where it's reflected back? So I went, now what am I going to do? So I got a mirror and I held it up to my drawing and that helped me see the reflection of what I would draw in the past. So I had to do another drawing, of what was reflected in the past. One of the things I did for one of my friends has a gallery in San Francisco, and he wanted me to do a piece. And this was the beginning of the COVID thing. So I wanted to do this kind of allegory because we all went to hell. It's kind of the idea of Persephone going into the earth. And we've been in hell for 2 years. So the idea of this was that it would be, Persephone picking the flowers, entering the gates of hell, and coming out and slowly reforming, like with this kind of like, with a positive message at the end, which is where we are now, except the wind is blowing like hell, right? And it's kind of like really underdressed for my trip here. So like one of the interesting things about coming here over the years is kind of paralleled the 3 segments of my career. The first part was garden and climate, the second part was landscape as art, and now, then it was cartooning the landscape, and now as you see it's moved in the kind of the tarot thing. But Paul Hellman, who was here a long time ago, and I've never really been able to thank him, I tried to track him down, but he had this idea to do a book where he would contact all landscape architects and they would talk about what influenced them as kids that made them go into landscape architecture. And there are books for poets and writers on this similar vein. So I came up with this idea. What really influenced me as a kid was model railroads. So I did this piece, I penciled it all out, it was really great, and I sent it to him, and nothing happened, and nothing, like it just somehow he couldn't get the other, for some reason he couldn't get the other landscapes like Martha Short's, even Michael Laurie Olin, turned him down for some reason. So it didn't go anywhere. So I had this really, great drawing. So I inked it up, watercolored, sent it in a Landscape Architecture magazine, and they printed it immediately. And that started me off doing a whole series on kind of creative thinking for Landscape Architecture magazine. But I have Paul to thank for that. Like it's funny, it didn't go, it's socially like everything doesn't have to go somewhere, but it eventually, if it's a good idea, eventually it'll show up at someplace else. So cartooning the landscape to kind of fill you in on the theories. Like when you're in college, you'll have a couple of books that'll affect you for the rest of your life. One of the books that affected me the most was Carlos Castaneda's Teachings of Don Juan. And in that, Carlos is working on his PhD. He goes to the Southwest to try to find a medicinal wizard to kind of teach him about sacred plants and stuff. Anyway, this developed into a long relationship where Carlos Castaneda is taught how to see. And so this had a big effect on me. So like when I graduated from college, I spent like 6 months in the American Southwest looking for a wise kind of medicine man to teach me a way of knowledge. Never found anything. Ended up like moving to Miami, which was at that time the armpit of America, and working in a really corporate office for a long time. And I remember one lunchtime, being really pissed off at what was going on in the office. I went down to Kylie Ocho, and there was someone who had a Kylie Ocho shirt on this morning. It's too bad she's not here. And I'm walking by what I thought was a bookstore. As it looked closed, I stopped for some reason and went into the bookstore. My eyes adjusted, and this man comes around the corner, and he hands me a book, and he says, I want you to read this, and when you're done, come back and talk about it. So the irony of this is so Zen, right? You know, like you spend nothing happens in a vacuum. You spend your time looking for someone to teach you a way of knowledge, and you give up, right? And you're in the worst place in the world, right? It's hot, it's sweaty. I'm walking down Calle Ocho, the worst part of Calle Ocho, and I stumble across this kind of mentor-teacher. And that became cartooning the landscape, and this relationship went on for like 3 years, and he was the one that kind of introduced me to kind of like winning the Rome Prize. And just to talk about the creative process, you know, like I find working on bits and papers when I'm on BART back and forth, this is how I would come up with different ideas, you know, so I'd, you know, like work out the whole chapter. There's 6 comics would have these secret elements of knowledge. One of the things I'm really proud of, this was my hero when I was in high school. I learned to draw from copying Woody Allen's drawings, and this is a cartoon he did called My World, which I really adored. So like I kind of created our world, which is about how landscape architects heal the landscape. And that was sort of my tribute to Wally Wood. And this is my process. I'll do ink drawings, I'll scan them and print them out on watercolor paper and then watercolor them. And then before I watercolor them, I make a cardstock Xerox, and that's how I test my watercolors first. It gives me the confidence to go in and do the final watercolor. This was the series for Landscape Architecture magazine. And you know, like when we talk about mentors and wizards, you guys are so lucky to have Joe here. Like, I mean, I've known you like the first time we met at the pool hall, right? And you rode your bicycle to the pool hall, and like, I mean, it's one of the most amazing. I mean, you talk about, you know, and I talked about a place where you'd want to go sit down and draw. I think I actually sat at your desk when I got to sit at his desk. I mean, if you've ever had a chance to see his studio, it's definitely, you know, landscape art. It's definitely Hogwarts. You know, I mean, this is definitely a magical place. And his drawings. I mean, we're going to talk. You know, I'm working on a new book now. I'm hoping I can coerce him into using some of his books. But nobody draws better than this. They kind of like the direct connection of the subconscious and his playfulness, I think, and the joy of the work that he does and is producing is really, really quite phenomenal. And then, you know, you think about Savannah, like, you know, like she came with us on the sketch crawl I did the last time. And it's kind of, I'm going to put this in the last drawing in my book on field sketching, because the whole idea is to teach you how to be children again, to think like a child. You know, like her one-step process of how to draw a tree, I think is really wonderful. And Cadence, you know, he didn't even know who I was, and he drew this picture. So you talk about prophecy, right? Like, I mean, how did you know? How you really got my mustache down? I mean, how old are you? You know, like, you really, you know, the mustache is really great. You know, like, I think you're going to have to grow one of those mustaches yourself. And this is like, you know, this is her example. This is from your class, right? Like she's drawing, this is how you draw trees. I wish I could draw trees like this. You know, I wish I could go back to drawing trees like this. So this was a really great sketch crawl. So Saturday we're going to do a spirit walk. And, you know, like I guess for sale out here is cartooning the landscape. So if you I do a nice drawing and you get a free powerful shit, you know, I guarantee you get a nice powerful shit button, which in some Irish bars you can get a free Guinness with this, but not all of them. You have to know, you have to know what Irish bar that is, you know, like to get your free Guinness. This was after an exhibit I had in Scotland. That was a good time. So like to begin, like how can we kind of bring these woodland spirits into we make landscapes, right? And like who are the woodland spirits and divinities that are going to inhabit these landscapes? I think that's really important. And I really think, you know, like I've come in the last 5 years really believe that what we do is magic. You know, it's transformative. You know, it's powerful. You know, like you're kind of like bioremediation. You can't go wrong by planting a tree. You know, like maybe a Buddha or a Buddha-essa, you know, will appear under that tree and gain knowledge from one of those trees that you plant. So good. Thank you. Next stop, the pool hall. Any questiones? And here's if you want to look at this on my website. This is our Wisdom of Place website. That we're kind of putting up the work. We just got a book contract to do our book called Wisdom of Place on tarot cards. No, sure. So. How many people have had their cards read? Look at this. It's almost more than half the class. Amazing.
What's your advice for kind of re-sparking creativity because in college with other outside factors you kind of just lose that spark you used to have? So like what is your advice to just getting that creativity back?
I think, sometimes, creativity comes from the weirdest places, and I believe it's important to work as hard as you can, and then it'll come at some unexpected moment. The whole point is don't wait for the muse to come to you, like you have to go to the muse. So you have to be, if you're stuck, you just keep working. And I'm convinced that's why I like to use tracing paper overlays. That generation of ideas keeps going. And also there are a couple of things that I learned this at the American Academy, because there are people in all the different arts. Get together a salon once a week. I used to do this thing in San Francisco where we go to not Cafe Trist, but Vesuvio's Thursday night after work. We sit around and drink beer and talk. There's something about getting a group of like-minded creative people, but not just landscape architects, people from, writers and poets, like even like basketball players, and that generation, brings in ideas. And then, just try, I also find too, movies, reading, poetry. If you're stuck, read some poetry. If you, one of the things I found, one of my friends turned me on to Borges's work when I was in Rome, his book, The Labyrinths, and they're really short stories, and I'd find in my studio, I would read one of his short stories, I'd fall asleep, take a nap, and I'd wake up and I'd have some ideas. So even sometimes in the midst of trying to draw something, like read 10 pages of a novel, read some poetry, look at an anime, look at a Miyazaki film or something, because it doesn't, not everything, the external forces are really powerful. So it's kind of opening yourself up to those external forces, because who knows where it comes. I mean, it is a mystery. It's a sacrament. The sacraments are mysteries, right, in the Catholic religion. That the life is mystery. So where does it come from? You think about too, they talk about vibrations. How, and you're attracted to other people. What, we can't define that. What makes you attracted to someone? What is that? That's some magical thing we can't even define. But so it's kind of like setting up that dynamo to allow the inputs to kind of come from other directions. Does that help? Yeah. Oh, you had a question.
You brought things from this really fantastic, alchemy, tarot sort of position. What's your best advice for bringing that into projects that maybe have a less budget, or maybe clients that are kind of pushing back against that kind of energy?
You don't tell them. I believe in guerrilla design. It's like you don't tell them you're doing bioremediation, or that you're making a habitat for the kind of endangered owls, that you kind of bring it in. And there's also this other thing. Like I said, the ASLA might be entering in the age of Aquarius, because my wife is working with 3 women that kind of come from the yoga thing, but they're really into you think I'm in some weird space. They are way out there, and they've started to design. They're actually getting clients where they're kind of burying crystals in the landscape. They're cleansing the landscape from evil spirits, and they have more work than they can do. So I think we're on the cuffs of something like this happening. But I think you can use all of these elements secretly. You can create a metaphysical landscape, and the idea is that maybe they don't know it, but if you create the space, maybe they'll get it someday. They'll go, like that film 10 years ago. I finally figured out the grapes of wrath. That's a good thing. So that's what I would do. Don't tell them. Just do it. And then before you know it, clients with these interests will start to come to you magically. It's kind of an interesting concept. Any other questions?
Okay, what are your recommendations for the process of creating your own tarot deck? Sorry.
Oh, funny you should ask. I have a deck here. There's 2 ways of going about it. I mean, there's 78 cards in a tarot deck, right? And I think if you're starting off, I think the most important, the major arcana, there are 22 cards in the major arcana. So I think by taking your inspiration from the cards, I mean, whoever tarot cards really didn't know what they were doing, right? So, like tarot cards now are all based on the original deck, but where did that come from? So the idea is to look at the card and kind of be inspired. I mean, it depends on what the program is. For me, I was trying to create a catalog of sacred design elements, that we could use this as a way of kind of reminding us of those 78 sacred landscape principles. So the first thing would be to kind of set up, what do you want to do with the cards? It could be, wildlife species, or saving some sort of, or bioremediation, and how you might go. You're creating basically a vocabulary of form. And this also helps, like you said, you're stuck in the design process. Just by, dealing some cards could also help you kind of like find where you're going. Because the deck we're trying to use it's based on landscape principles, but we're not telling anybody that. Because I want to get all of the wow in this, like not just landscape architects. But they do say, it's interesting, they do say the tarot deck is alive. It's a living thing, which is, because, before I started doing this, I didn't think twice about the card. I just thought it was just hocus pocus. But that's also an interesting word, hocus pocus. Anyway, that's kind of what I do. Set up your program and stay with, like do the first 20, do the major arcana. And then if you get further into it, then the 4 suites can be earth, air, wind, and fire, or some sort of, you create a category of those, and then you come up with 14 design principles for each one of those categories. Yeah.
I'm just like blown away here. How many projects do you work on at a time?
Well, like right now, I have 2 book contracts Liz and I are doing. I don't know what the hell I have a portable art studio that I brought with me. So I got up at 6 this morning and worked for 3 hours before, doing, like I also found this, the more you get done. So like everything, so the idea is to keep going. And I think the more work you do, what do they say? Don't ever ask an idle person to do any work. Always ask a busy person. You'll get the work done. If so, people are idle for a reason. So I think the idea is, I mean, my thing is just read as much as you can, see as much as you can, travel, like always be open to ideas. The more closed-minded we are, the more we get into repeating the same thing. And that's another problem. It happens to firms a lot, and artists, they keep doing the same thing over and over again. Even Miyazaki, it's interesting. You'll see the same characters reappearing in his films, but they're always have a different role, which is kind of interesting. So, design that, get that vocabulary of form going, but kind of keep mixing it up. Yeah, I like the films of Fleischner, who's most famous for Popeye. Fleischer's work is he invented this. As you know, the landscape's alive. When you're in your car, you notice the foreground's moving really quickly, and the midground's actually moving in the opposite direction, and the mountains are moving in a different direction. So that's really hard to capture in animation. So what he did is he built this 12-foot round table that was movable, and he put the animation frame here where he put his cells, and he'd shoot the animation cell, and when he would shoot it with the camera, that would turn the landscape a little bit. So like if you look at some of his films, especially Play Safe, which is my favorite one because it's about trains, but you actually see the landscape actually moves in the background, which is really cool. Disney did it. Fleischer was the first one to invent it, but Disney invented the multi-plane camera, which is 12 feet tall. So when you watch particularly like Pinocchio, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, you can actually see like what he does. Each foreground, middle ground, background, actually there are 12 divisions, are on different glass paintings. And it also allows him to put the animation cells on different glasses. So you could actually have people moving in the distance. Each one of these glasses can move at a different speed. So the camera is up there, shooting down this way. And if you ever have a chance to go to the Disney Museum in San Francisco, they actually have one of the multi-plane cameras. And that wasn't as effective as Fleischner's thing, because the landscape actually moves this way, but it really is effective. That's the kind of thing I like. And I also like Tim Burton's work, The Corpse Bride, and also Nightmare Before Christmas, I think, are his film. And what was it, Frankenweenie? Frankenweenie. I thought that was really good, but the critics creamed it. I think he got fired from Disney. I think at some point, if you got fired from Disney, you would become a real success because you had ideas. So those are some of my favorite animators. There's the stop motion. I think it's Parker, the English guys that did The Wrong Trousers. Have you seen stop motion? Have you seen The Wrong Trousers? You should watch this. Some of the funniest sequence in the world in that. So I like stop motion a lot. That's good. Paranormal is good. No, I definitely want to do it. And, like my wife is doing it. Like I got behind in several of these writing projects and I can't participate. But I think the very first thing to do, if any space, I find the slow side. I like about Lawrence Halprin, ask Betty when he did, oh God, that's on tape. Oh, jeez. I hope this doesn't go into the landscape conservatory. But anyway, when he did Sea Ranch, he camped out at Sea Ranch for like almost a month. So that's why I think that project's really good. So I think the first thing is kind of and that's the problem with GPS. That's why that's another lecture. They asked me to do an introduction for coding the landscape. If anything is more foreign, why they wanted me to do, like a book, announcement, I don't know. But reading that pissed me off because it's all about removing ourselves further from the landscape. And it's not that I'm a Luddite. I think there's some remote sense. I think there are a lot of really important tools. It can't be all we use. Like what we did is, we got to get back to the landscape. So you have to go to the site and see the site. Like I said before, there are things going on that you can't get, looking at the GPS. And the spirits, I'm convinced. Well, we're, like the Americans live in this region. We know that all thing how to them. So we know the land is inhabited with like that's the other thing I say, like my first epiphany was the Greek and landscape were worshipped thousands and thousands of years. Where did they go? They're still here, right? I mean, they're still here. We just don't acknowledge. So that part of it is acknowledging them, opening yourself up that there is a spirit of the land. There is a genus loci. For the Romans, every sort of unique landscape had a genus loci. And one of the things I like about the Aborigines in Australia, they have something called song lines. Have you heard about this book? In the Moleskins earlier. But they actually sing the landscape. They're singing these ancient kind of like mythological songs of the spirits of the landscape. They use GPS. They sing the landscape. So they navigate by singing from one sacred landscape form to the other. So song lines, which I think is really cool. So things still exist. It's just a matter of accepting that they are and then being open to letting it come to you. Because you've all felt it. Because you're in Colorado, you're all outdoors people, right? I mean, I imagine you're skiing and hiking and chopping trees down and fishing, right? I imagine you're all like pretty aware that, because for one thing, why are you attracted to the woods? Why do you live here? I think most people that live here like the outdoors. So, I mean, why? There's obviously some nourishment there, I think. Does that help? Okay. There have been a few. The hardest one was the oracle tree that we just did. For one thing, we didn't know it was going to work. It was in Massachusetts and we were in California. We weren't sure how. We had to have like all these alternatives to hang the cards. I didn't know if you hang something from a tree, the wind will blow it like this, so we had to figure out how to get the cards to swivel correctly, and then what we thought how we were going to hang the cards didn't work. So I had like 100 yards of rawhide. Just good old we tied them to the trees with rawhide. So it was kind of really, really scary. We didn't know if it was going to work till it worked. And thank God while we were putting it up, people were coming up and wondering about and looking at it. Of course, like somebody came by and go, yeah, this is real Californian, you know. But anyway, that was a pretty scary kind of experience. So I think it's, you know, sometimes you just have to, you keep going forward, right? So what did Beckett say? I can't go on, I go on. You know, like even if, you know, like the solution will happen if we stayed in California and go, oh my God, we can't figure out how are we going to hang those, you know, like, but so we just did it. But it worked out, it really turned out well. I couldn't sleep for a month, you know, and then the thunderstorm that first night, the worst thunderstorms they've had in that part of Massachusetts, you know, like happened 3 days in a row. And it was still standing, like we were worried. The only thing is one of the cards wrapped around a limb from the wind, so we were able to fix that, so it worked pretty good. But generally, there's always that pit of fear. I think it's kind of like if you're an actor or an actress, and if you're not nervous before you go on stage, you're going to have a problem. So it's kind of like that element of fear or like hesitancy is something that's a good, because it makes you tentative or more aware, you know, like more engaged in it. Because you just whip it off. You know, you've probably done this, right? You know, like, oh, you know, it looks like shit, right? But the more fearful you are, the harder you work, you know, like it just will turn out better. So it's a good thing to have. I can always tell when something good or bad. At 4 a.m. in the morning, I wake up with butterflies. Antenna, you know, I get those. You know, I can kind of. I'm not getting the honor award this year. You you wake up at 4 in the morning and you know. So that's another important thing.
Your drawing, I feel like you just jumped into it and like dived in. How do you perfect creating that portal moment with your drawing and like creating that space?
I think, that's hard to explain, but for me, when I'm getting into a drawing, when I get it set up, I'm in the space. It's kind of like, like it's funny to hear like Miyazaki, the same thing happened. I try to get into the space, and if you think about it, everything we do is three-dimensional. So part of it is getting small, and the idea is like imagine yourself in the spaces that you're designing, whether it's on the computer or whatever. Like if you're in the space, that'll really help you be in there. And it's kind of like, remembering your dreams, you do it in a sequence. And if you can kind of get through one thing, kind of lucid dreaming, you go to the next thing, you can kind of start to begin to feel like you're in the space. Because when you're drawing and everything's going really well, because if I'm out in public and I'm drawing and somebody taps me on the shoulders, I jump right out, because it's concentration. So part of it is concentration. Everybody's listening to music now. So somehow using Gregorian chants or some sort of like music that maybe is more enchanting, like who is it, the Finlandia, Sibelius. Sibelius's music, has that sort of like, some music that takes you like Tibetan chanting or something. There's a reason you chant over and over again. So maybe using some sort of music aperture to kind of further engage you in the space could be helpful. Oh, you mean, I'll basically do anything. If someone said, Chip, will you design a stage set? I think that's one of the great things about this profession, is it prepares you to do anything. You can come up with an idea, right, from nothing, and make it, you're making the unbelievable believable, right? And then you can present it to a hostile audience, right? So you can actually present it, and it's a sham wow. You can convince someone that it is. So I think that's important. And I think I'm just open to do anything. And as far as that too, it's like like we're talking about how to get the creative process going. Go to museum exhibits, go to poetry readings. There's so much going on at the university. There's too much. There's like 2 lectures a day, 2 public lectures here. So it's kind of like, getting out there and seeing as much as you can. The other thing I do that I think is really important is I trick myself into working, but I also use goals and rewards. Like I'll say, like, I'm going to get a chapter done, or I'm going to get these 3 drawings done, then I'll smoke a cigar and have a Guinness. When I was drawing the landscape, I'd finish a chapter before I had that cigar and a Guinness, which really cut down. I lost a lot of weight. It was good, But you kind of like, if you reward yourself, like even daily, you say like, well, I'm not going to watch, what is Ted Lasso now? Like I'm going to finish my work first, and I'll reward myself watching Ted Lasso or whatever you're streaming, and try to just watch one sequence, because they really suck you in, no matter what. Yes.
One last question. I was wondering this about my professors. If you can sum down like the 5 main factors that drove you to where you are today, such as being a landscape cartoonist and an artist and landscape architecture, what were the main 5 factors in your life that really motivated you and pushed you into this career?
I think that's, and the scary thing about teaching, because some offhanded comment you can make to your student can change their life forever, was when I was in my senior year, and I was walking into the studio, and Herrick Smith was taping up a poster for Harry Stowers, who graduated from our program, and he was having an exhibit of his paintings. And that was on the wall. And I came in and I saw that as Harry was putting it up, and I said, well, that's not landscape architecture. And the professor turns around and he goes, yes, that is landscape architecture. And that was an epiphany for me that made me realize that landscape architecture can be an art form. It opened up, like, instead of containing it, it opened it up to the whole thing that I think is really, really important. The other mentor that I had, it's also like sometimes out of kind of agony, good things happen. When I worked at Sasaki, it was really corporate. But one of the good things that happened to me is when I went to the Boston office, I met one of my other mentors, Frank James. And like he saw me drawing, and I was drawing away, and this little man, bald-headed man, comes over the corner, grabs the pencil out of my hand and goes, that's not how you do it. And took it, just like watching an angel draw, he took that pencil and drew, like, went across, showing me the textures of grass, pavement, asphalt, all the way across. And then later, someone came over to me at the end of the day and says, Frank wants you to come over to his house. So I went over there, and it became a lifelong thing. There were a lot of people there, but Frank said, come upstairs, I want to show you something. So I went upstairs into this little garret. It's again one of those spaces where I want to sit down and draw. She started to show me these drawings, and he became my mentor. The other thing too that I think is important, they say when a student is ready, a teacher appears, and I never expected to teach, but they say when a teacher is ready, students appear. It's a funny thing. So when you're ready, these mentors will come, and you're lucky if you have 1 or 2 great professors in your life. Those are like 3 of the, I think, really important lessons I had. And also, the bookstore owner, that Al, which is interesting. His name's Al, but I always wonder if it's O-W Al, L. The first book he gave me was The Plant Between Heaven and Earth. It talks about the axis mundi, that, plants are growing to the light. And I never could figure out what religion or like what his belief was, a Steinerism or, Rudolph. I didn't, but so he never, he wasn't prophesizing, but he was giving me books, and I was supposed to get, have a kind of talk with him about what I was learning. So that's 4. I don't know if I can get to 5. Billiards, I think that was the thing. Yeah, learning how to shoot pool is the best life lesson I've ever had. Yes. I think Studio Ghibli, like in Japan, and also I didn't show it, but you should look up, Miyazaki did a giant clock outside, that's kind of a mechanical clock on the side of a really dull building. I can't remember the name of it, but in Tuscany there's a Tarot clock that's based on the Tarot that's also pretty neat. There's in Paris, there's that fountain. Is it Miro that did it? There's a fountain outside of that new contemporary building, but it's also whimsical. So there's a lot of examples, I think, of really fun stuff. I think generally as landscape architects we take ourselves too seriously, and I think programmatically now that what I've seen with a lot of parks is everybody's putting too much stuff in there because we were trying to appease everybody. And one of the best parks I saw was in France, which was just a rectangle urban park with gravel and trees around the edge. And everybody was having fun. There was no program. It was kind of open. So it's kind of like being careful of putting too much stuff. I think it's kind of like, in Zen and also Chinese landscape paintings, the negative space is more important than the positive space. So that's something that I think about. Oh, and of course my favorite landscape is Toontown in Disneyland. That's where I want to live. They're opening up an apartment for me when I retire. I'm going to live in Goofy's house. Yeah, I already have my passport, right? Goofy land. No more questiones? Yeah. Well, it's interesting, like I've learned, the lecture I gave tonight is fresh. I just learned this, and it comes from teaching sacred landscapes. I'm watching Miyazaki films and just enjoying them. But the more I study them, the more I watch them, the more I learn. And I think that's the other thing. Good literature has many, many meanings. It's deep. And I think that's one great thing about Miyazaki's film is there are all these levels. We get it on the first as entertainment. And then the more I study his films, the more I realize that, like there are some really important ecological messages in there. So I think that's kind of like taking something not at face value, but kind of look at what is the message. Everything is kind of built up. I think that's one of the things I get out of Miyazaki. And I know I'll keep learning from his work. There's a lot. I have 2 books of kind of, and he's an interesting guy because he really doesn't talk about his work. Most of the interpretations of his work are from other people interpreting his work, because I think this is also important, he's a very humble person, he's not an egotist, so he kind of doubts what he's doing, so there's that kind of like doubtfulness, and the humble thing, I think maybe that's what leads himself to being such a great creator, is being humble. Kind of like, if you're humble to the creative spirit, I think they'll come to you quicker than if you say, like, I'm the designer, It's my way or the highway. You're not going to get anywhere. Does that help? Did that answer your question? Did I come close? Sometimes I'm Mr. Tangent. As you can see, that's how my drawings work, tangent-dental. So I guess next stop is the pool hall, where I'll be giving, free drinking and billiard shooting lessons. Okay, thank you.